Okay, so there's all these factors that's promoting racism of Tejanos towards, I'm sorry, Anglos towards Tejanos. But really, what's fueling this is land, the desire for land on the part of Anglos. Um, Anglo Americans, I guess I can call them Americans now, and Anglo Americans come into Texas. And what they want is land. And what do they want um, the land for? Well, you should know by this time they want to grow cotton. Why do they want to grow cotton? Because cotton's the most valuable commodity on earth. It's somewhat like oil today. Um, and Texas, East Texas, had long been recognized um, as one of the best potential areas for growing cotton in all of North America. The Spanish never got into growing cotton, and the Mexicans never did either, because they never really got into slavery into a big way. They may have winked, especially Tejanos, about the introduction of slavery, but they never had gotten into slavery in a big way. And one of the things about the Tourget book, he talks a lot, and I think very movingly, about just the massive amount of work it took to go into East Texas and to to cut down these trees and to clear the land and to grow the cotton. And I'm not being romantic about this, because who's doing the work? Well, sometimes it's whites, but often it's African Americans. It's slave labor under really horrendous conditions, under constant threat of punishment, of family separation, um, um, uh, sexual assaults on African American women, slave women, very common. So I'm not being romantic about the Texas pioneers. There's a lot of pain behind this. Nonetheless, the East Texas is prime cotton country. For one of the reasons is it gets a lot of rain. Um, Eastern part of the state gets about 40 inches of rain a year. And it's also relatively easy to get the cotton to the Gulf of Mexico via the rivers that flow, the Colorado, the Trinity, the Brazos, etc. Remember, there's not great transportation networks in Texas at this point, and the most reliable ones, although they're not completely reliable, are the rivers. So Anglos coming in, Americans coming into Texas want land. They're land hungry. They want the land in almost every case, or in most cases, to grow cotton with slave labor, because they want to make money. It's about money. And as they come into Texas, they run into what turns out to be a very, very minor speed bump. And this minor speed bump is that much of the land in what had been Mexican Texas just a few years before had been awarded Tejanos first by the Spanish government and then by the Mexican government. So this land, much of the land that these Americans wanted, was already owned by Tejanos because of grants during the Spanish-Mexican period. And this proves immensely frustrating to Americans, and they begin immediately trying to undermine these claims, intimidate Tejanos into selling land. And what you're seeing in Texas in the early post-revolutionary period, post-1836 period, is a land grab, a massive land grab, where Americans are coming into the Republic of Texas and doing anything that they can do to thwart the ownership claims of Tejanos of land, especially in East Texas and Northeast Texas. Um, Now, for Tejanos, post 1836, even those that had supported the revolution, immediately turns into the world is upside down. Almost immediately, their world turns upside down, and Texas becomes a very hostile place to Tejanos. More and more over time, but it begins immediately. But it gets worse as Americans come into the Republic of Texas wanting to purchase land. So one of the things, and it's pretty obvious, but it's something you might not think about, is suddenly now all the business is done in English. What most Tejanos did not know English. Why would they know English? They lived in Mexico. So suddenly now, business is starting to be transacted in English, which was an unfamiliar language to Tejanos, and some folks tried to, English is learnable as is Spanish, but it's not an easy thing to do. The politics of the Republic of Texas, it's a new set of rules for Tejanos. They had been used, although they were very unhappy with the Spanish and Mexican government for the most part, who they felt like Mexico City ignored them. They at least kind of understood the rules of the game. Well, when Americans come into Texas, there's new rules of the game, and I think maybe most importantly, there's a new system of law that comes into Texas. Instead of the Spanish system of law, which Tejanos had been working with for centuries, now you have an Anglo-American version of law that comes from English common law, which in some ways was profoundly different from what the what the Tejanos were used to. And as I said before, there's a sense that Tejanos are inferior. They're an inferior people racially, and that most Tejanos had some way been involved in the massacres at Goliad and the Alamo, although of course that wasn't true. So what you had is basically, as Americans are coming into Texas, what they're trying to do is take land from Tejanos who, in many cases, had owned this land for generations. So there are many tactics that Americans use, white Americans, as they come into Texas. Um, Intimidation was always a favorite. Sell me your land or I'll kill you. I'll burn down your house. I'll whip you. I'll beat you up. And the reason this intimidation worked is the courts in the Republic of Texas often looked the other way. So a Tejano could come in and report this intimidation. First of all, you have the language barrier. But the court just might not care. The sheriff might not care. The sheriff might be the person intimidating you, right? And so suddenly now you have just this whole different world that is ruled by a completely different set of people with a different set of rules, and who are often supportive of what's going on, these land grabs. So what you had also is a new survey. The Texas government wanted to survey Anglo-Texas. So let me see how deep I am into this. So they appointed a team to survey the land of Texas. They wanted to know really what they had. But only Anglo-Americans were allowed to take part in these surveys and to run these surveys. And so, of course, Tejanos, and to the extent that native peoples understood what was going on, they just feel like, well, this is ridiculous. They're just setting this whole thing up to take our land from us. What you have in Nacogdoches, you have the idea, and it's very unclear what happened. A man by the name of Vicente Cordova, he tried to gin up some kind of anti-Texas feeling in the Nacogdoches area. And this gets all tied up into the Cherokee. Remember, I talked about the Cherokee. There was some suspicion that the Cherokee were going to align with the anti-Texas Tejanos. And so Cordova was accused of fomenting this revolution against Anglo-Texas. It never went anywhere. Cordova actually ended up escaping into Mexico and disappears from history. But after these threats of an uprising, and again, it's very unclear exactly what they were, how serious they were, but Anglos in the Nacogdoches area took advantage of this to basically drive Tejanos out of East Texas. So Tejanos that had lived in Nacogdoches for, hundreds of years, and remember Nacogdoches was created when the Spanish tried to make San Antonio the capital, and they had kicked people out of East Texas. So Nacogdoches was reestablished in what, the 1770s or something. And what you had was is the folks in Nacogdoches who had been there for generations, who had fought in order to live in Nacogdoches, are kicked out. They're expelled from Nacogdoches, in deeper further deeper into the Republic of Texas, uh, towards the Rio Grande border. So what you start having in Texas, and this will happen in Austin later, and in other Fayette County later, you have what today we call ethnic cleansing, where Tejanos are literally kicked out of certain areas of Texas because they're seen as a threat. They're either pro-Mexican or they're working with slaves, or these are kind of all excuses. But underlying all this are massive land grabs on the part of Americans who come into Texas wanting cheap land, wanting to grow cotton in many cases. They see that Tejanos own this land, and they do everything in their power to undermine the ownership rights of Tejanos, and they're quite successful in this effort.